वो महंगाई इतनी ज़्यादा हो गई है कि किसी के बस में ही नहीं रहा।
In Pakistan, electricity supplies to households and industries have been cut. The cash-strapped country can no longer afford to buy natural gas or coal from overseas to fuel its power plants. In the neighborhoods of cities, residents are installing diesel generators for power cuts and spare water tanks for when the taps run dry. It's a tough situation that is not limited to certain areas. In fact, factories, hospitals, and even mobile phone networks are shutting down in many places, leaving almost the entire country of 240 million people without power for most of the day. People are now struggling to find creative solutions to survive inflation, which hit a 14-year high of 31.5%, the highest level since 1975. The impact is being felt across the country, from cities to rural areas, with poorer people being hit the hardest as inflation touches every basic necessity. The price of petrol has skyrocketed, going up by 80%. The situation is dire, with people forced to endure long queues and even risking getting crushed to buy subsidized flour. Making matters worse, the country has been suffering the devastating effects of monsoon flooding last summer, which displaced 8 million people and cost the country an estimated $30 billion in damage and lost output. Tens of thousands of people are still homeless, and tens of millions of people in the country live on less than $3.20 a day. In South Asia, Pakistan's inflation rate is second only to bankrupt Sri Lanka's rate of 51%. The situation in Pakistan is reminiscent of the pressures that brought the much smaller Indian Ocean island state to its knees and upended its government. Currently, Pakistan is facing an economic crisis fueled by high global oil prices, rising agricultural imports, and economic mismanagement. And if that's not enough, the Pakistani rupee is crashing, having traded at an all-time low of 280 to the dollar. With foreign exchange reserves declining, the country is now facing its worst balance of payments crisis in peacetime. Pakistan is a uniquely troubling country. It is the world's fifth largest by population, prone to instability, extremism, and nuclear armed. In other words, it may be the first country to fall this year. So, how did Pakistan go so terribly wrong? Pakistan has been facing economic challenges for a long time now, and they have become quite predictable. Their reliance on imports and the lack of sufficient dollars coming in have led to several balance of payment crises over the years. On top of that, the country has also taken on piles of debt that did not generate foreign exchange, using Chinese financing, particularly to build things like roads and power plants that have failed to boost sluggish export numbers. This trade deficit may seem like a horrible, no good, very bad thing. The reality is that many countries experience a negative balance of trade without major consequences. Borrowing is a common solution used by countries to offset negative trade balances, but this approach may not always be sustainable, especially for Pakistan, because their government has a long history of gross economic mismanagement. Just last year, on April 10th, the 22nd Prime Minister of Pakistan, Mr. Imran Khan, was removed from his position in a no-confidence motion. The decision was reportedly influenced by the army generals, who wanted to shift Pakistan's stance away from Mr. Khan's anti-Western posture and undo the perception that the country is China's lackey. The military basically replaced one set of corrupt politicians with another in order to sustain its own power base. Pakistan has a history of military involvement in running the country since gaining independence in 1947, whether through military dictatorships or by pulling strings behind the scenes. Political leadership often relies on the military to balance power between political players without considering the negative consequences of involving the armed forces in managing the state. However, when a military government prioritizes short-term gains, it can have serious, long-term consequences for the entire country. This behavior can corrode the functioning of government and weaken democracy, leading to a lack of representation for different groups. When the military becomes too powerful, it can exacerbate the situation even further. As seen in the recent coup in Myanmar, military intervention can completely undermine the will of the people and lead to widespread condemnation. Ultimately, these actions work against the interests of ordinary citizens and can create an unstable and uncertain future. In Pakistan, the military's involvement goes beyond politics and extends into business as well. Many current and former military personnel have taken on important roles that impact the country's economy. These roles include running government agencies such as power, water, telecoms, housing, and state-owned firms such as the Civil Aviation Authority and the National Institute of Health. The military's business has grown significantly since 1954. This segment of the economy is not transparent to the public and is not held accountable by the government. This type of business only serves the interests of a specific group of people, making it inherently illegal. Additionally, as seen in the case of Pakistan, an increase in the military's economic activities is directly proportional to its political power. The military generals in Pakistan often try to justify their involvement in the business as a means of contributing to the country's socio-economic development. However, many of these economic operations end up being a burden on both the defense budget and the larger national budget. This is because they either use state resources or divert money from the defense budget to finance deficits. The fact is that Pakistan only spends 2.4% of GDP on education compared to 17.8% on the military, which is the lowest even among South Asian and neighboring countries. Moreover, the military's internal economy has many hidden costs, such as encouraging crony capitalism and limiting the growth of a free market economy. Of course, military involvement in business is not limited to Pakistan. Many other countries, including Thailand, Indonesia, and Brazil, have had similar practices during their developing stages. However, as their economies grew and their militaries became more professional, they began to withdraw from direct participation in the economy. Unfortunately, this did not happen in Pakistan. What the country needs is a hard reset. We could put all politicians on a boat and send them on an extended vacation, but the current situation has been corrupted beyond repair. Still, the world cannot afford to let Pakistan collapse, given the risk posed by its nuclear capabilities falling into the wrong hands. There's a system for this sort of thing, the equivalent of bankruptcy for nations. In such situations, organizations like the IMF and World Bank step in. Pakistan has a long history of receiving aid from the IMF, with its most recent bailout totaling $6 billion in 2019. However, bailouts come with conditions such as the requirement for a functional government and the implementation of potentially unpopular economic policy. The IMF needs assurance that the country will not find itself in the same position within 6 months. Unfortunately, this time the situation is different. Pakistan is struggling to get another IMF bailout due to its upcoming election, and its politicians have a history of spending lavishly to lure voters. Even though the IMF has provided substantial financial aid, the amount offered is still a penny compared to Pakistan's total debt burden of approximately $240 billion. Much of Pakistan's external debt, which totals around $126 billion, comes from a range of multilateral and bilateral sources, including the Paris Club, a group of Western lenders, as well as the IMF and China. In fact, China alone holds around $30 billion of Pakistan's external debt. According to World Bank data, between 2010 and 2020, the external debt of poorer nations more than doubled to $860 billion. During the same time, the share of external debt owed to China by poorer nations skyrocketed from 2% to 18%, making China the world's largest sovereign creditor to developing countries. China's lending practices to poorer countries have been criticized for leaving them struggling to repay debts and vulnerable to pressure from Beijing. However, while it may be easy to point the finger at Chinese loans, the reality is more complex. In recent years, some developing nations have found themselves in dire financial straits. For example, Sri Lanka was the first to default on its foreign bondholders this year, although Sri Lanka only owes 10% of its debt to China. It has been plagued by issues such as disastrous policies and high food and fuel prices, which have resulted in protests and political turmoil, ultimately leading to economic collapse. Now, the spotlight has shifted to other countries like El Salvador, Ghana, Egypt, Tunisia, and Pakistan, all of which are perceived to be at risk of default. In the case of Pakistan, the situation is particularly precarious as it only has $3 billion in foreign currency reserves to cover 3 weeks of imports. Economists are cautioning about a decade of lost growth for the most vulnerable countries in the world, as many have experienced a deeper slide into poverty amid the COVID pandemic compounded by the war in Ukraine. A pile of distressed debt totaling $250 billion is now a looming threat, putting the developing world at risk of cascading defaults. Whatever the case, time is of the essence for Pakistan, currently the most populous country on the verge of defaulting. Pakistan must make some painful decisions to break free from its endless cycle of bailouts and crises. The country's debt has reached an unsustainable level, and restructuring may be the only way to avoid becoming another Greece or worse. Unfortunately, restructuring the debt will lead to a lost decade for Pakistan and reverse decades of progress in healthcare, education, and prosperity. Delaying meaningful economic reforms could exacerbate economic hardship and social unrest. Therefore, Pakistan must take action to address its debt problem and implement necessary economic reforms.